The air in the cemetery was thick with the scent of lilies and hypocrisy. Grayson Payne, millionaire widower, stood by his wife's grave, dabbing at a dry eye with a silk handkerchief. He played the part of the grieving husband flawlessly. But just hours later, he would walk into the most important meeting of his life, the reading of his wife Rachel's will, with a woman who was not his wife. He brought his mistress a declaration of victory over the woman who had built his empire. He expected to inherit everything. What he inherited instead was a perfectly executed masterpiece of revenge delivered from beyond the grave. The final handful of dirt landed on the polished mahogany of the casket with a soft, definitive thud. It was a sound of finality, the closing of a chapter. For most, it signaled the end of Rachel Beaumont Payne's quiet, elegant life. For her husband, Grayson Payne, it was the sound of a starting gun. He stood a picture of somber dignity in a bespoke charcoal suit, his face a carefully constructed mask of sorrow. He held a single white rose, which he let fall into the grave, a gesture he'd seen in a movie and thought was suitably dramatic. The press, kept at a respectable distance by a discreet security team, captured the moment. Tomorrow's society pages would read, "Grieving magnate Grayson Payne bids a final heartbreaking farewell to his beloved wife, Rachel." It was a masterful performance. Only a few people present knew the truth. One of them was Rachel's brother, Robert Beaumont. Standing a few feet away, his jaw was a tight, angry line. He watched Grayson's every move with unconcealed contempt. Robert knew that Grayson's grief was as hollow as his promises. He had seen the way Grayson's eyes would glaze over when Rachel spoke of her passions, art philanthropy, the intricate details of the very businesses that funded his lavish lifestyle. He had seen the casual cruelty, the subtle dismissals, the slow, methodical erosion of his sister's vibrant spirit. The other person who knew was standing under the shade of a distant oak tree, trying to appear unconnected to the main party. Her name was Brenda Lowe. She was younger than Rachel, with a hungry look in her eyes and a wardrobe paid for by Grayson's private credit card. She wore a black dress that was a little too tight, a little too short for a funeral. She was Grayson's mistress, his poorly kept secret, and in her mind, the queen in waiting. She watched Grayson, a faint, proprietary smile on her lips. Their time was coming. As the small crowd of mourners began to disperse, offering hushed condolences, Grayson maintained his sorrowful facade. He accepted handshakes and pats on the back, his voice a low, gravelly murmur of thanks. She was a wonderful woman, Grayson. A pillar of the community, said one of his board members. The best Grayson agreed, his gaze momentarily flicking towards the oak tree where Brenda stood. "I don't know how I'll go on." Robert Beaumont approached, his face like a thundercloud. "A word, Grayson." Robert Grayson said, his tone shifting from mournful to weary. "Not now. This is a day for grief." "Is it?" Robert's voice was low and biting. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like a day of opportunity for you. I just want you to know I'll be watching. Rachel was my sister. I won't let her legacy be tarnished." Grayson's mask slipped for a fraction of a second. A flash of anger tightened his features. "Your sister's legacy is perfectly safe. It's with me, her husband. As it should be." He turned his back on Robert, a clear dismissal, and walked towards his waiting limousine. The chauffeur held the door open. Before getting in, Grayson paused and subtly gestured with his head. Across the manicured lawn, Brenda understood the signal. She waited a few moments, then began a casual stroll toward a separate gate, where another car, one Grayson had sent for her, was waiting. Inside the plush leather interior of the limo, Grayson finally dropped the act. He loosened his tie, poured himself a generous measure of whiskey from the built-in bar, and downed it in one gulp. The sorrow evaporated, replaced by an impatient, almost giddy energy. He was free. For 20 years he had been Mr. Rachel Beaumont. It was her family's old money name that had opened the first doors. It was her quiet, uncanny business acumen that had turned his modest inheritance into the Payne-Beaumont corporate empire. She was the architect, he was the face. She preferred the background, the balance sheets, the strategic plans. He craved the spotlight, the magazine covers, the applause. He had come to resent her for it, to see her quiet competence as a judgment on his own abilities. He convinced himself that he was the visionary, and she was merely the manager. Brenda was different. She looked at him with wide-eyed adoration. She told him he was a genius, a titan of industry. She didn't challenge him or offer quiet corrections. She just agreed, and admired and spent his money with breathless enthusiasm. His phone buzzed. It was Brenda, headed home. "You are so strong, my brave man." A smirk played on Grayson's lips. He typed back, "Pour us a drink. We have a lot to celebrate." He poured another whiskey, staring out at the city skyline as the limo sped away from the cemetery. All that was left was the final formality, the reading of the will. It was scheduled for 10 a.m. the next day at the downtown offices of Holloway and Associates, Rachel's family law firm, for 3 generations. It would be a simple affair, he was sure. Rachel was traditional. Everything would go to him, her devoted husband. He'd give a generous donation to one of her pet charities to keep up appearances, of course. He might even let Robert keep his seat on the board as a token gesture. Later that evening, in his cavernous penthouse apartment, an apartment Rachel had always found cold and ostentatious, Grayson and Brenda toasted with champagne. The funeral was a distant memory. To the future, Brenda said, clinking her glass against his. She was wearing a silk robe, her hair undone, lounging on the white leather sofa. Our future. Our future, Grayson repeated, a wide, genuine smile finally breaking across his face. Tomorrow it all becomes official. The lawyers, the board, her insufferable brother. They all have to listen to me now. Are you sure it will all go to you? Brenda asked, a flicker of anxiety in her eyes. Grayson laughed, a loud, booming sound. Darling, who else would it go to? I was her husband. We built this empire together. He conveniently omitted the truth of who did the actual building. It's a formality. In fact, he said, a new, audacious idea taking root. I want you there with me. Brenda sat up, her eyes wide. At the will reading, Grayson, should I with her family there? Why not, he declared, feeling bold, invincible. It's time we stopped hiding. You are the future Mrs. Payne. It's time they all saw that. Let Robert choke on his self-righteousness. I want him to see that I've already moved on, that the future is mine, and you are part of it. The idea thrilled him. It wasn't just about claiming his inheritance. It was about rubbing it in their faces. It was a final public declaration that he had won. Rachel was gone, and he was here with his beautiful young mistress, ready to take everything she had left behind. It was the ultimate power play. Brenda's initial hesitation melted away, replaced by a triumphant gleam. To be there at the very heart of the transfer of power, to see the Beaumont family's faces as Grayson claimed his prize, it was more than she could have dreamed of. Okay, she whispered, leaning in to kiss him. I'll be there, right by your side. As Grayson drifted off to sleep that night, he felt no guilt, no remorse. Only the sweet, intoxicating taste of victory. He was the king, and tomorrow was his coronation. He never once considered the possibility that his quiet, unassuming wife, the woman he had so thoroughly underestimated in life, could ever outmaneuver him in death. The boardroom at Holloway and Associates was a study in old-world power. Floor-to-ceiling mahogany shelves were filled with leather-bound legal texts that smelled of time and authority. A long, polished oak table reflected the grim, overcast sky, visible through the large window overlooking the city's financial district. The air was thick with tension, a silent, crackling energy that made the simple act of breathing feel deliberate. At the head of the table sat Mr. Jonathan Holloway, a man who seemed carved from the same mahogany as the walls. He was in his late 70s with a shock of white hair and eyes that had seen the quiet dramas of the city's elite play out for over 50 years. He had been Rachel's father's lawyer, and then hers. His loyalty was to the Beaumont family, a loyalty that was absolute and unshakable. His expression was impeccably neutral, yet his gaze was as cold as a banker's heart. To his right sat Robert Beaumont. He was the picture of aristocratic rage, his back ramrod straight, his hands clasped so tightly on the table his knuckles were white. His eyes were fixed on the empty chair at the opposite end of the table, waiting. Also present was Susan Pierce, the long-time chief financial officer of Payne Beaumont. A sharp, intelligent woman in her 50s, Susan had been Rachel's protégée and closest confidant within the company. She owed her entire career to Rachel, and her face was a mask of stoic grief and quiet resolve. She knew better than anyone how much of the company's success was due to Rachel's genius. The boardroom door opened, and Grayson Payne strode in. He wasn't wearing somber black today. Instead, he'd chosen a sharp navy pinstripe suit, a power suit. It was a statement. But the bigger statement was the woman on his arm. Brenda Lowe entered with a mixture of nervousness and defiance. She wore a cream-colored Chanel suit that was clearly new, her hair perfectly coiffed. She held on to Grayson's arm as if it were a life raft and a trophy all at once. Her eyes darted around the room, taking in the opulent surroundings and the hostile faces. A collective intake of breath seemed to suck the remaining air from the room. Robert Beaumont's face went from pale with anger to a deep, dangerous crimson. He looked as if he might launch himself across the table. Susan Pierce's expression hardened her lips, thinning into a single disapproving line. Only Mr. Holloway remained impassive. He simply raised an eyebrow, a minute gesture that still managed to convey a mountain of disdain. Grayson Robert spat his voice a low growl. "What is the meaning of this? Who is this woman?" This Grayson said, his voice booming with false confidence as he pulled out the chair at the end of the table for Brenda, before taking his own. "Is Brenda Lowe. My associate. She's here for support." Support Robert's laugh was a harsh, ugly sound. "The funeral was yesterday. Your wife is barely cold, and you bring your whore to the reading of her will. That's enough, Robert." Grayson snapped his face, flushing. "Show some respect." Respect. Robert was on his feet now. "You dare to lecture me about respect? You who flaunted your affair while my sister was fighting for her life. You have no idea what that word means." "Gentlemen," Mr. Holloway's voice cut through the tension like a razor. It wasn't loud, but it carried an undeniable weight of authority. "Please, be seated, Mr. Beaumont. We are here to execute the last will and testament of Rachel Beaumont Payne. Personal animosities have no place in this room." Robert shot one last venomous glare at Grayson and Brenda, before slowly, reluctantly sitting back down. The silence that followed was heavier than before. Grayson, feeling he had won the first skirmish, leaned back in his chair, draping an arm possessively over the back of Brenda's. He gave Mr. Holloway a patronizing smile. "Please, Jonathan. Proceed. Let's get this over with." Mr. Holloway adjusted his spectacles and picked up a thick vellum document sealed with wax. "This is the last will and testament of Rachel Beaumont Payne, signed and witnessed on the 3rd of May of this year." Grayson's smile faltered slightly. "The 3rd of May. That was only 6 months ago. Deep into her illness. Deep into his affair with Brenda. He had assumed her will was years old, written when things were simpler. A brief flicker of unease went through him, but he quickly suppressed it. What could she have done? She was sick weak. She adored him, he told himself. She couldn't have cut him out. "Let us begin," Holloway said, his voice a dry monotone. He broke the seal. "I, Rachel Beaumont Payne, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament, revoking all prior wills and codicils." He read through a series of minor bequests. A generous sum to the long-serving household staff, a collection of antique jewelry to a favorite niece, her personal art collection donated to the City Museum with a wing to be named in her family's honor. All expected. All standard. Grayson nodded along, feigning benevolent approval. Brenda was starting to relax her hand, finding its way to Grayson's on the table. Then Mr. Holloway paused. He looked up from the document, his gaze sweeping over each person in the room, before finally landing on Grayson. "We now come to the primary assets of the estate," he announced, the room growing still once more. "This includes all majority shares in Payne Beaumont Corp. Control of the associated trusts and holding companies, the real estate portfolio, and the liquid assets held in her personal accounts, the total value of which is estimated at $950 million. Brenda's breath hitched. She squeezed Grayson's hand tightly. This was it. The number was even bigger than she had imagined. Grayson's chest puffed out. He felt like a Roman emperor about to be crowned. He gave Robert a smug, triumphant smirk. According to Mrs. Payne's instructions, Mr. Holloway continued, his voice unchanged. The distribution of these primary assets is not a simple transfer of title. He paused again, letting the weight of his words settle. It is contingent upon a series of conditions and revelations to be presented now in this room. Grayson's smirk vanished. Conditions. What conditions, Jonathan? What is this nonsense? We had an agreement. Everything was to pass to me. Your marital agreements are a separate matter, Mr. Payne Holloway said coolly. This is about her will, her assets, and her final wishes. She was most specific in her instructions for this meeting. She wanted all relevant parties present to bear witness. His eyes flickered towards Brenda for a split second. Relevant parties, Robert interjected, looking confused but intrigued. Indeed, said Holloway. He reached beside him and pressed a button on a small, discreet remote control. On the far wall, a large screen, previously hidden behind a wood panel, slid open and hummed to life. "What the hell is this?" Grayson demanded, rising from his chair. "A movie screening." In a manner of speaking, Mr. Holloway replied, his voice laced with the faintest trace of something that might have been grim satisfaction. Rachel was a meticulous planner. She felt some things were best said in her own words. On the screen, an image appeared. It was Rachel. She was seated in a comfortable armchair in her private study, the one place in their home Grayson rarely entered. She looked thinner, frailer than he remembered, but her eyes were crystal clear, sharp, and held a fire he hadn't seen in years. She was looking directly into the camera as if she could see them all right there in that room. A pre-recorded message. The unease in Grayson's stomach curdled into a cold, hard knot of dread. Brenda stared at the screen, her face pale. The ghost of the woman she had replaced was about to speak. Rachel on the screen offered a small, sad smile. Her voice when she spoke was calm, steady, and utterly haunting. "Hello, Grayson," she said, and the sound of it filled the silent room. "I trust you are all comfortable. I imagine you're surprised to see me." Let's not pretend we don't know why we are all here. You're here for my money. Robert, you're here to protect my legacy. Susan, you're here out of loyalty. And Grayson, you're here for your crown. Her gaze seemed to pin him to the spot. Before we get to the disposition of my estate, she continued, her voice unwavering, I have a few truths I'd like to share. Things I should have said long ago. Let's call this a final audit. The screen went black for a moment, and then a new image appeared. It was a document, a receipt. Grayson leaned forward, squinting his heart beginning to pound a frantic, heavy rhythm against his ribs. It was a jeweler's receipt, dated from the day of their 20th anniversary, for a diamond necklace, a necklace he recognized instantly, the one currently clasped around Brenda Lowe's neck. The image of the receipt hung on the screen, a digital ghost of Grayson's betrayal. It was dated just 8 months prior, on the very day he had told Rachel he was tied up in an emergency board meeting that ran late into the night. He had come home with a bouquet of wilting gas station roses, apologizing profusely. Rachel, already weakened by her first round of treatment, had simply nodded her eyes, full of a weariness he had mistaken for acceptance. In the boardroom, the silence was absolute, broken only by Brenda's sharp, involuntary gasp. Her hand flew to her neck, her fingers touching the cool diamonds of the L'amour éternel necklace. It had been Grayson's first truly extravagant gift to her. He'd told her it was a custom piece, something he'd designed just for her. The receipt on the screen clearly listed it as a standard, if obscenely expensive item from Cartier. Robert Beaumont stared first at the screen, then at the necklace on Brenda's throat, and finally at Grayson. A low, guttural sound of pure disgust escaped his lips. Susan Pierce simply closed her eyes, as if in pain. Grayson's mind raced, searching for an explanation, a denial, a way to spin this. But there was none. The evidence was irrefutable, displayed in high definition for everyone to see. On the screen, Rachel's image returned. Her expression was not one of anger, but of a profound surgical disappointment. Our 20th anniversary, she said, her voice soft, but carrying the immense weight of memory. I was at home waiting. I had cooked your favorite meal, coq au vin. I remember being so careful with the spices, because the chemotherapy was making my own sense of taste and smell so unreliable. I wanted it to be perfect for you. You called at 9 p.m. to say you were stuck in a meeting with the Henderson Group. A crisis, you said. A multi-million-dollar deal on the line. She paused, letting the lie hang in the air. I found that strange, Grayson. Because I had spoken to Walter Henderson that very afternoon. He was on a yacht in the Greek Isles with his family. He sent his best and asked me to wish you a happy anniversary on his behalf. Grayson felt the blood drain from his face. He looked at Brenda, whose own face was a mask of confusion and dawning horror. He had told her the necklace was a celebration of their 6-month anniversary. The dates didn't line up. She was beginning to see the casual, layered nature of his deceit. That was the first of many lies I chose to see, Rachel continued from the screen. I hired a private investigator the next day, a regrettable necessity. It turns out you were not just a liar, Grayson. You were a cliché. The screen changed again. This time it was a photograph, a candid shot taken from a distance. It showed Grayson and Brenda laughing as they exited a notoriously expensive restaurant. Grayson's arm was around her waist. It was the night of their anniversary. The Cartier box was visible in his other hand. Brenda made a small, choked sound. She wasn't just the other woman. She was the living, breathing evidence of a lie told to a dying woman on a day that should have been sacred. The triumph she had felt walking into the room curdled into a sickening wave of shame. The Chanel suit suddenly felt cheap and tawdry. "But this isn't about my broken heart," Rachel said, and the shift in her tone was palpable. The sadness was replaced by a steely resolve. "This is about my legacy, and the first condition for the distribution of my assets concerns the Beaumont Foundation for the Arts, a cause my father started, and which I have funded for 2 decades. Grayson seized on the change of topic, desperate to move past the personal humiliation. "The foundation, of course. I intend to make a substantial contribution in your name, my love," he said to the screen, his voice slick with false sincerity. Rachel's recorded image smiled a chilling, knowing expression. "I'm sure you do, Grayson. However, you often told me my passion for the foundation was a sentimental waste of money. You argued we should cut its funding by 80% and redirect the capital into your riskier ventures. Like that disastrous oil speculation in Venezuela, you lost $10 million on last year." Susan Pierce shifted in her seat. She knew the details of that loss all too well. Rachel had quietly covered it from her personal funds to prevent a shareholder panic. Therefore, Rachel announced, "My first stipulation is this. Effective immediately, the sum of $50 million will be irrevocably transferred from my personal liquid assets to the Beaumont Foundation's endowment." Grayson shot to his feet. $50 million, that's insane. "That capital is essential for market leverage. Please sit down, Mr. Payne," Mr. Holloway said calmly. "The transfer has already been executed. I initiated it this morning, as per my instructions. It is done. $50 million. Gone. Just like that." It was a significant blow, but still in the grand scheme of the nearly billion-dollar estate, it was a flesh wound. Grayson sank back into his chair, fuming but trying to recalculate. He could absorb it. "This is just the beginning." Rachel's voice echoed in the room, her eyes seeming to bore into his very soul. "You see, you thought my illness had made me weak. But it did something else. Instead, it gave me clarity. It gave me time to think. And it made me realize I had spent 20 years building a beautiful, strong house for a man who was determined to rot it from the inside out." She leaned forward slightly in her chair on the screen. "So I decided to do some renovations. Let's move on to the business, shall we? Let's talk about the company you so proudly call your own. Let's talk about Payne Beaumont Corp." The screen faded to black, leaving the room in a stunned, ringing silence. Grayson's mind was a maelstrom of anger and fear. This wasn't a will reading, it was an ambush, a meticulously planned, posthumous prosecution, and he was the sole man in the dock. He looked at the faces around him. Robert's simmering rage had been replaced by a grim, vindicated awe. Susan's quiet grief was now tinged with an almost imperceptible steely admiration. Brenda was staring at her hands, refusing to look at him, the diamond necklace feeling like a millstone around her neck. The power he had felt walking into the room was gone, replaced by a terrifying vulnerability. He was no longer in control. Rachel, his quiet, gentle dying, Rachel had reached out from the grave, and her hand was closing around his throat. The black screen was a momentary reprieve, a dark mirror reflecting the stunned faces in the boardroom. Grayson's heart hammered against his ribs. The business! She was going after the business. The very idea was preposterous. He was the chairman, the face of the company. She hadn't set foot in the main office for years, preferring to work from her study at home. What could she possibly have done? The screen flickered back to life, not with Rachel's image, but with a complex corporate flowchart. It showed the structure of the Payne Beaumont empire. At the top was the main corporation, but branching off it were dozens of smaller LLCs, holding companies and offshore entities. It was a web Grayson himself only vaguely understood. He left the boring details to the finance department to people like Susan Pierce. Then Rachel's voice returned, disembodied and authoritative, like a university lecturer dissecting a complex theorem. "Hello again, Grayson. I'm sure you recognize this chart. It's the corporate structure you've presented to shareholders for the last decade. It looks impressive, doesn't it? Solid, strong, a testament to your leadership." A red line began to trace a path through the chart, isolating the main Payne-Beaumont Corp from a cluster of smaller entities. "But looks can be deceiving," her voice continued. "You see the heart of our company. The real engine of its growth and profitability has never been its physical assets or its market share. It has always been its intellectual property." Grayson frowned. Intellectual property? He thought of the patents for their manufacturing processes, the copyrights on their software. They were valuable, sure, but I'm referring specifically, Rachel's voice clarified, as if reading his mind, to the portfolio of over 200 international patents for our proprietary chemical bonding agents and the source code for the Helios logistics software that revolutionized our supply chain. Together, they account for roughly 60% of this company's valuation and 100% of its technological edge over our competitors. On the screen, the cluster of smaller entities began to glow. "You probably assumed those patents and copyrights were held by Payne-Beaumont Corp," Rachel said. "A reasonable assumption. But they never were. 20 years ago, on the advice of my father, I created a separate, privately held technology firm. A shell company, if you will. Let's call it Beaumont Innovative Technologies. All of my research, all of my development, every patent I filed, every line of code I helped design, was registered to and is legally owned by that entity." Grayson stared at the screen, his mouth agape. He felt a cold sweat prickle his brow. He had no memory of such a company. Payne-Beaumont Corp. Rachel explained, her voice as calm and precise as a surgeon's scalpel has been operating for 2 decades under a licensing agreement with Beaumont Innovative Technologies. A very generous, royalty-free licensing agreement which allowed the parent company to use this IP as if it were its own. The red line on the chart turned into a pair of scissors and snipped the connection between the two entities. And per the bylaws of this private company, that licensing agreement is subject to review and termination by its sole owner. Which was me. She paused, and is now my designated successor. A collective gasp went through the room. Robert Beaumont leaned forward, his eyes wide with disbelief and dawning comprehension. This was a move of breathtaking corporate genius. Who Grayson choked out his voice, barely a whisper. "Who is the successor?" As if on cue, Rachel's image returned to the screen. She was smiling, but it wasn't the sad smile from before. This was a smile of pure, unadulterated triumph. "I believe you all know Susan Pierce," she said. Every head in the room swiveled to face the quiet CFO. Susan met their gazes without flinching. Her hands were folded calmly on the table in front of her, but her eyes, when they met Grayson's, were like chips of ice. Mr. Holloway cleared his throat. "I have the documents here," he said, sliding a thick legal folder across the table toward Susan. "Transfer of ownership of Beaumont Innovative Technologies, effective as of the moment of Rachel's passing. It is all in order. Ms. Pierce is now in complete control of the company's most valuable assets." Grayson felt as if the floor had fallen away. He was the chairman of a hollow shell, a company that owned buildings and trucks, but not the science and software that made it dominant. He was a king without a kingdom. "The board," he stammered. "The shareholders, they'll never stand for this, won't they?" Rachel's voice was laced with irony. "Susan, perhaps you can enlighten him." Susan Pierce spoke for the first time, her voice clear and steady. "As of 9 a.m. this morning, as the new owner of BIT, I sent a formal notice to the board of Payne Beaumont. The royalty-free licensing agreement has been terminated, effective immediately. I have offered them a new agreement. A new agreement, Grayson repeated numbly. Yes, Susan said. A standard market rate licensing deal. Payne Beaumont will now have to pay Beaumont Innovative Technologies 35% of its net profits for the continued use of the IP it was built on. 35%. The number was staggering. It would cripple the company. It would decimate their stock price. Dividends would vanish. His entire financial world was collapsing in on itself. Furthermore, Susan continued, her voice relentless. As I am sure you'll recall from the corporate charter, you never bothered to read, Grayson, any such fundamental change to the company's financial structure triggers a leadership review clause. The board is holding an emergency meeting this afternoon. Your position as chairman will be on the agenda. It was a coup. A bloodless, brilliant, posthumous coup. Rachel hadn't just taken his money. She had taken his power, his identity, and she had given it to the one person she knew he could never bully or control, her loyal protégé. On the screen, Rachel's image softened slightly. You were always so concerned with the face of the company, Grayson. The interviews, the galas, the magazine's covers. You can keep the face. Susan and I were always more interested in the heart. And now the heart is hers to protect. She looked down for a moment, as if gathering her strength for the final blow. But a business is just a business. It's built on numbers and contracts. A marriage, however, is built on trust. And that, Grayson, that is a debt you can never repay. The screen shifted again. The corporate charts vanished. In their place appeared a new image, one that made the blood in Grayson's veins turn to ice. It was a still frame from a security camera. The timestamp in the corner was from 3 weeks ago. The image was of a hospital room. In the bed, a frail, sleeping Rachel. And standing beside the bed holding her hand was Brenda Lowe. The image on the screen was grainy, the colors washed out under the fluorescent hospital lights, but the scene it depicted was brutally clear. Brenda, looking hesitant and somber, stood by the bedside of the sleeping Rachel. The stark contrast between the two women was devastating. Brenda vibrant and healthy in a stylish coat. Rachel diminished by illness, her skin pale against the white hospital sheets. In the boardroom, Brenda let out a strangled cry, a sound of pure panic. No, that's not. Grayson, what is this? She pleaded, turning to him, her eyes wide with terror. Grayson was speechless. His mind was a blank white noise roar. He remembered that day. Brenda had been consumed with a morbid curiosity about the woman she was supplanting. She had pestered him with questions. What was she like? Was she beautiful? Did she know about them against his better judgment, fueled by arrogance and a cruel desire to demonstrate his complete control? He had pulled strings with a hospital administrator he had on his payroll to allow Brenda a brief, unauthorized visit while Rachel was sedated after a painful procedure. He had told Brenda it was so she could see for herself that the past was truly over. It was a grotesque, triumphant tour of his conquered territory. Now that act of supreme hubris was playing out as his damnation. Rachel's voice returned, but it was different now. The cold, businesslike tone was gone, replaced by a quiet, aching sadness that was somehow more cutting than any rage could have been. I wasn't asleep, Brenda, she said, her voice seeming to address the younger woman directly. The sedation had worn off. I just kept my eyes closed. I wanted to hear what the man I loved, the man I had spent half my life with, would say about me in my final days. The still image on the screen dissolved into video. The silent, grainy footage began to move. Grayson could be seen just at the edge of the frame, his back mostly to the camera, speaking to Brenda in low tones. There was no audio, but his gestures were grand dismissive. And then audio began to fade in. It was tinny, clearly recorded from a hidden device. A small microphone Rachel's voiceover explained that her brother Robert had insisted she keep by her bedside for security. Grayson's voice, smug and condescending, filled the boardroom. "See for yourself," his recorded voice said. "There's nothing left. It's just a matter of time. It's sad, of course, but it's a relief in a way. The end of an obligation." Robert Beaumont clenched his fists, a tear of pure fury tracing a path down his cheek. Brenda's recorded voice was a nervous whisper. "Does she know about us now?" Grayson's laugh was a cruel bark. "Darling, look at her. She hasn't had a clue about anything for years. Too busy with her books and her charities. I've been living a separate life right under her nose. It was pathetically easy." In the boardroom, Brenda flinched as if struck. The casual cruelty of his words, the dismissal of the woman he had been married to for 2 decades, was shocking. But what came next was for her alone. She was useful, I'll give her that. Grayson's voice continued on the recording. Her name, her mind for numbers. She built a magnificent cage for me. But you, my love, you are the one who showed me how to be free. Brenda stared at the screen, her expression crumbling. This was what she had wanted to hear, the validation she craved. But hearing it now in this sterile, accusatory environment, it sounded hollow and parasitic. Then came the final devastating blow. Brenda's voice on the tape, hesitant but hopeful. "And when it's over, we can finally be together, properly as husband and wife." There was a pause. Grayson's recorded voice shifted, becoming placating, patronizing. "Of course, darling. Of course. We'll have the world. Just be patient. We have to handle this transition delicately." The video stopped. Rachel's face reappeared on the screen. She was no longer looking at the camera. She was looking down, as if at her hands in her lap. "Did you believe him, Brenda?" she asked softly. "Did you really think a man who could speak about his dying wife that way would ever treat you with genuine honor? A man who calls 20 years of partnership an obligation. A man who sees love not as a bond, but as a cage." She finally looked up her eyes, finding the camera lens again. And in them there was not hatred. There was only a vast, soul-wearying pity. "He told me about you too. Not in the way you think. He didn't confess. He complained. He complained that you were delightfully simple, but that your taste in fashion was ruinously expensive. He told me you were a necessary distraction, a way for him to feel young again. He called you his beautiful, empty-headed little hobby." Each word was a perfectly aimed dart. Brenda made a small, wounded noise and visibly recoiled. Her entire fantasy of being the great love who had freed the Titan from his dreary wife was being systematically dismantled. She was not his queen. She was his hobby. An expensive, simple-minded toy he had grown tired of complaining about to the very woman she was meant to replace. Grayson turned on her, his face a mask of purple rage. "She's lying. She's a bitter, dying woman, trying to poison you against me." "Am I?" Rachel's voice, calmly interjected from the screen. "Ask him, Brenda. Ask him about the pre-nuptial agreement I had my lawyers draft for you 2 months ago. The one he asked for. The one that would have left you with nothing, not a single share, not a single dollar if you ever tried to divorce him." Mr. Holloway, without being asked, opened his briefcase and produced another document. He didn't say a word, simply placed it on the table in front of Brenda. It was a draft of a pre-nuptial agreement between Grayson Payne and Brenda Lowe, The terms were brutal ironclad and utterly humiliating. Brenda stared at the document, then at Grayson. The illusion shattered completely. The adoration in her eyes was replaced with a horrified, dawning contempt. She had been a fool, a pawn in his game. He wasn't going to make her his wife. He was going to make her his next possession, one with a legal document ensuring she could never escape with any of the spoils. With a sudden violent movement, Brenda reached up and unclasped the L'amour éternel necklace. The heavy diamond chain felt like a snake around her neck. She threw it on the table where it landed with a loud, clattering crash. "You are a monster," she whispered to Grayson, her voice trembling with rage and humiliation. Then she stood up, pushed her chair back so hard it nearly toppled over, and walked out of the boardroom without a backward glance. She didn't run. She walked with the stiff, wounded dignity of someone who has just had their soul flayed open and put on public display. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving a stunned, deafening silence in its wake. Grayson was alone, stripped of his mistress, his allies, and his dignity. Rachel's face remained on the screen. Her expression was somber. "The thing about betrayal, Grayson," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "is that it's a fire that consumes everything. Not just the good, but the lies too. And now all your lies are ashes. And now," she said, her voice regaining its strength for the final matter, "for what is left of my inheritance." The departure of Brenda Lowe had shifted the atmosphere in the room from a tense confrontation to a clinical dissection. All the drama, the sordid personal details had been stripped away, leaving only the cold, hard facts of Grayson's character laid bare on the polished oak table. He was no longer a powerful chairman or a grieving husband. He was just a man exposed and diminished, waiting for his sentence. Grayson stared at the screen, a hollowed-out expression on his face. What else could she possibly take from him? She'd taken a fortune. She'd taken his company. She'd taken his mistress. All that was left was the husk. Rachel's image on the screen seemed to sigh, a gesture of profound exhaustion that transcended the digital medium. "We come now to the end, Grayson," she said. "To the final disposition of my estate. The houses, the remaining liquid assets, the personal holdings, everything that is left after the Foundation's endowment and the corporate restructuring." She paused as if choosing her next words with infinite care. "All my life I have been surrounded by weight, the weight of my family's name, the weight of expectation, the weight of our company's portfolio, the weight of your ambition, Grayson. It was a heavy burden. And in my final months I came to realize I wanted my legacy to be one of lightness, of setting things free." Grayson scoffed a bitter, broken sound. "Lightness. You've crippled the company and aired my life like a cheap stage play. What do you know of lightness?" "The company will survive," Rachel's voice replied unperturbed. "It is now in the hands of someone who values its heart, not just its share price. Susan will see to it. It will be a leaner company perhaps, but a more honest one. As for your life, you aired it yourself, Grayson. I simply provided the screen." Her gaze seemed to soften for a final time. "Our prenuptial agreement, the one we signed all those years ago, was very clear. It was written by my father, a man who understood character. It stipulated that in the event of a divorce, our assets would be divided based on their origin. What was mine remained mine. What was yours remained yours. But it had a peculiar clause for what would happen upon death. It stated that all assets would be pooled and bequeathed as a single estate under the assumption that a marriage was a true and faithful partnership until the end." A sliver of hope, desperate and irrational, flickered in Grayson's chest. A loophole, however. Rachel continued, and the hope died as quickly as it came, that same agreement contained a fidelity clause. A clause you likely never read. It states that in the event of proven marital infidelity, the terms of the prenup revert to the stricter origin of asset rules as if it were a divorce. Mr. Holloway nodded gravely. The evidence presented today, the receipts, the photographs, the recordings, is more than sufficient to invoke the fidelity clause. I have already filed the necessary legal petitions this morning. They will not be contested. It was the final, perfect legal checkmate. She had known about the clause. She had gathered the evidence. She had built her entire posthumous strategy around a single paragraph of legalese he had ignored 20 years ago. "So what is left for you?" Grayson Rachel asked, her voice a gentle murmur. "What did you bring into this marriage? You had a small stock portfolio from your father, which you cashed out to fund our first venture. An initial investment of $250,000. By my calculation, with 20 years of interest and inflation, that comes to roughly $1.5 million today. $1.5 million. To a man who had woken up this morning, believing he was worth nearly $1 billion, the number was a comical insult. It was less than the annual maintenance cost of the penthouse. "That sum has been transferred to your personal account," Rachel stated. "It is yours. Free and clear. As for the rest, the nearly $800 million that remains in the estate." The screen changed one last time. It showed a montage of images, a children's hospital wing being built, a university library, a sprawling wildlife sanctuary, scholarships being awarded to bright-eyed students. It is all going to the newly formed CBD Charitable Trust. Rachel announced, dedicated to funding medical research education and the arts. Its board of trustees will be chaired by my brother, Robert Beaumont, and its finances will be managed by Susan Pierce. It will be their life's work to ensure that the wealth we built is used to create, to heal, and to inspire, to add some lightness to the world. Robert Beaumont stared at the screen, his face a mixture of shock and profound gratitude. He looked at Susan, who gave him a small, determined nod. This was their new purpose, a legacy of creation, not destruction. So you see, Grayson Rachel concluded her own image, returning for the last time. You get to keep what you started with, and I get to keep what I built. It seems perfectly fair, don't you think? Her face was serene. There was no malice left, no anger, just a quiet finality. "There is one more thing," she said. "The penthouse, the apartment you loved so much. I never cared for it, but you always said it made you feel like a king. The lease is paid up for the next 6 months. You may stay there until it expires. But the furniture, the art, everything inside, it was all mine. It is being moved out this afternoon and sold at auction for the trust. I've left you a bed, a chair, and a table. I thought you might need a place to sit and think about the choices you've made." The screen went black. The message was over. For a long moment, the room was utterly still. Grayson sat frozen, staring at the blank screen, the enormity of his ruin crashing down on him. He was no longer a millionaire. He was a man with a small fortune that would barely cover his debts and legal fees. He was the chairman of a company that would oust him by sunset. He was the owner of an empty penthouse he would be evicted from in 6 months. He had walked in this morning a king ready for his coronation. He was leaving with nothing but a bed, a chair, and a table. A monk's inheritance. Slowly, Mr. Holloway began to gather his papers, the rustling sound unnaturally loud in the silent room. He stacked the documents into a neat pile. Robert and Susan stood up their chairs, scraping softly against the floor. They didn't look at Grayson. It was as if he wasn't there anymore. He had been erased. "Our work here is done," Mr. Holloway said, his voice flat and professional. He gestured to a separate, smaller folder. "Mr. Payne, this contains the details of your transfer and the notice regarding the penthouse. My assistant will see you out." Robert and Susan walked to the door. Before leaving, Robert paused and looked back, not at Grayson, but at the blank screen where his sister's face had been. "Thank you, Rachel," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Rest now." Then they were gone. Grayson was left alone in the mahogany-panelled room with the old lawyer. He felt a tremor start in his hands. A rage so profound it was almost silent began to build in his chest. He looked at the diamond necklace Brenda had thrown on the table, glittering mockingly under the recessed lighting. With a primal roar, he swept his arm across the table, sending the necklace water glasses and legal pads scattering across the floor. The sound echoed in the vast, empty room. Mr. Holloway didn't even flinch. He simply watched his expression unchanged as Grayson Payne, the fallen titan, finally, completely and irrevocably came apart. The aftermath was a swift and public execution. Headlines chronicled Grayson Payne's spectacular downfall, while the board of his former company ousted him in a unanimous vote. Every legal appeal against the meticulously crafted will was dismissed, leaving him utterly neutered. His world had not just cracked, it had disintegrated. He retreated to the penthouse, but Rachel's final calculated cruelty had been to turn his palace into a prison of echoes. Stripped of its lavish furnishings by efficient movers, the apartment became a cavernous tomb where his footsteps mocked the silence. He was left with a bed, a table, and the crushing weight of his ruin. Brenda, the catalyst for his greed, had vanished without a trace, another ghost in his newly empty life. In stark contrast, Rachel's true legacy flourished. The CBD Charitable Trust, guided by an invigorated Robert Beaumont and a brilliant Susan Pierce, began its work with purpose. The wealth once spent on ego and excess now funded hospitals, scholarships, and the arts. Rachel's memory was not defined by her revenge, but by the good that grew from its ashes, a testament to her quiet, enduring strength. 6 months later, an eviction notice sealed his fate. Grayson packed a single suitcase, a phantom in the life he'd once commanded. As he took a final look across the desolate living room, a glint of light caught his eye. Near the wall lay a single, flawless diamond, which must have fallen from the necklace he had used to seal his fate. He picked it up. It felt weightless in his palm, a perfect, glittering symbol of everything he had lost, brilliant cold, and utterly empty. He closed his hand around the stone and walked out of the apartment for the last time. The lock clicked shut behind him, a sound as final as a coffin closing. Grayson Payne, the man who had it all descended into the anonymous city below his entire billion-dollar world, reduced to the size of a single, bitter tear. Rachel's story is a chilling reminder that the quietest voices often carry the most powerful truths. Her revenge wasn't a passionate, fiery outburst, but a cold, calculated masterpiece of justice, proving that the ultimate power isn't in wealth or status, but in intelligence, foresight, and the unbreakable strength of a person who has been underestimated for the last time. It's a testament to the idea that a legacy is not what you own, but what you create, and sometimes the most enduring structures are the ones built from the ashes of betrayal. If this story of intricate revenge and posthumous justice captured your imagination, please let us know in the comments below. What part of Rachel's plan did you find the most brilliant? Don't forget to hit the like button. Share this story with someone who appreciates a tale of true justice, and subscribe for more stories of drama, intrigue, and karma. Thank you for listening.